We're now going to look at animal altruism. These are meerkats, and they're found in South Africa, desert areas, type of mongoose, and they're very well adapted to those areas, but there is danger in the desert. So here we see a group of meerkats. They are found in groups. They live in family groups. There may be non-family members as well. I'm not sure about that, but you can see that they're off doing different things. This one's all perched up like that. That one's on the lookout as well. Some are digging. And that's where altruism comes into play.
But a hungry meerkat has his head buried in the sand and his backside dangerously exposed. The sentries are needed to keep a lookout for danger. They use not only their sharp eyes, but also their keen sense of hearing.
So those are sentries. You can see the way they're perched up like that, and if they spot danger, they utter an alarm call that causes the others to try to get underground in their burrows as soon as possible. And you can see the sonogram, the sound spectrogram of the alarm call notes on the bottom of this screen. Just to simulate, they disappear underground. Same thing. Okay. Nest helpers are really, really interesting. It occurs in a variety of species. What you're looking at here is the Florida scrub jay. And it's been probably studied the most in the scrub jay than in any other species. These are closely related to the blue jay, but these guys are found in Florida. So what a nest helper is, these are young birds that have reached adulthood. I mean, they could leave and start their own brood, but they don't. They hang out during the initial breeding season and help their parents rear the next brood of offspring. And then ultimately they'll go off and leave and start their own families. These birds are remarkable. In the Florida field station, where I happen to be visiting, though none of these pictures involve me, but they're so used to humans being around studying them and not terrifying them that they'll just come and they'll land on you when you step out of your van. And actually I found it quite annoying. But I'm just not used to being out in the wild and have birds land on me like that. Like what you see happening with these guys. But, they're okay. They don't peck at you or anything like that. There's no aggression. They're just used to humans being around studying them. Here's another guy. The guy who's filming this is actually holding that bird. The bird's gonna leave and fly right on top of that guy's head. Just like that. Oh, he is getting pecked. Very gently, though. Okay, scrub jays. So what they do is they hang around. They look for predators. If they see predators, they'll help drive them off. They search for food along with the parents, and then they'll bring food back to the nest and help feed the offspring. So we see the next brood here being fed. And what just flew off a moment ago was a helper. And they'll also help chase other scrub jays off of this territory. I mean, these are territorial birds, especially during the nesting season. And there's a scrub jay from another territory that wandered into this territory, and these are helpers that are actually chasing it away. All they want is that guy to get off the territory, that's all. So they're basically doing what the parents do, helping out the parents a great deal. nest helpers. This is an instance of nepotism, but in ants, we tend to only think about these things happening in vertebrates. Well, here's an insect example. Now, what the experimenters did in this experiment was to tether an ant. So there is a nylon tether, which I've just kind of drawn here in yellow. And so they're tethered to this piece of paper, and they bury the paper under this sand. And then this ant can't get away. It's tethered to the paper buried under the sand. Now, they look to see what other ants would do. Ants from the same colony, homocolonial ants, same colony, are, of course, relatives. Well, maybe you didn't know that. They are relatives. When you have a colony of ants, they are all related to one another within that colony. Notice that the only rescuing that's occurring in terms of how long it's the rescuers are trying to free this ant, even though they're not able to, by the way, but they keep trying, only occurs via these various mechanisms: digging the sand, transporting sand away, trying to pull the ant's limbs to free it, biting the snare, the monofilament line that has it, even though they can't really bite through it, is only occurring with homocolonial ants, the ones that are from the same colony. It doesn't occur at all to the same species but from another colony or another species of ant, or they used all kinds of controls here, prey, and God knows, I don't even remember what the other control was. Doesn't matter. They're only helping homocolonial ants, in other words, relatives, in other words, nepotism. This just shows you how this was all set up. These are just two different videos. I put them on the same screen just to save some time. The ant in the middle of each is the one that's tethered, and these ants are pulling the limbs, trying to dig away at the covering of the piece of paper, which they can do. It's just not going to do any good until the experimenter, of course, comes along and frees the ants. You see little colors on them. Those are just markers that the experimenters put on the ants so that they could identify individuals in this colony. Trying very, very hard to free their homocolonial kin. And they've almost got the paper totally uncovered in the bottom one there, but again, that's as far as they're going to really get. So, nepotism in ants. Okay, here's conspecific altruism and heterospecific altruism, and it involves humans, and it even involves chimpanzees. It involves a dropping task, and again, this was done in a laboratory. Okay, he dropped a clothespin, and the infant is going to come over just like that and help this guy out. He's making like he can't reach it, obviously. Relies on the infant. I guess it's a toddler. Infants can't really stand like that. And he gives it to him. By the way, a study was just published in 2014 showing that this is something that develops via specific experiences involving reciprocal exchanges. In other words, playing with toys. So if you have an adult play with a toy with a kid, and sometimes the kid gets to play with it, but then other times the adult gets to play with it, but then allows the kid to play with it again. In other words, back and forth reciprocity in terms of who gets to play with toys, for example. Those are the kids that will do what we saw here at a slightly older age, and even older than that. Like they were retested, I think, when they were like preschool, just before school started, like I guess at the age of 4 or thereabouts. And without that kind of experience, they don't behave altruistically. So that's a brand new study, kind of interesting. But okay, this is the conspecific one. Let's look at this interesting heterospecific one involving a dropping task with a human and a chimpanzee. And of course, he's making like he can't reach it. And there goes the chimp and gets it for him. Altruism. So does helping really help? Let's look at the meerkat example. Here's some data collected in 2001. And it turns out that the more helpers that there are around that are actually helping, the greater the pup weight will be. So they're going to be gaining more weight, which at that young age, by the way, is a good thing. They'll grow faster, and they'll even have better foraging success once they reach the stage of juvenile. So it does help to be helped. Oh, and even greater survival rate through the first year of life. Let's look at birds. Okay, this is a gray-crowned babbler, so this is another nest-helping species. If you remove helpers from a territory, just the experimenter comes along and gets them out of there, so the parents are left to rear the young on their own of the next brood, then the reproductive success decreases of the parents. They have considerable less luck rearing that next brood without the help of the helpers. Well, do the helpers gain anything from helping? What do they benefit? Well, again, another study with the gray-crowned babbler. They do inherit territories. If something happens to their parents, for whatever reason they leave the territory or they're preyed upon, then the helpers will immediately inherit their parents' territories. They don't have to worry about trying to set up their own. Of course, once they inherit it, they have to successfully continue to defend it, but the territory is theirs. And they also are more successful in rearing their first brood of offspring. So the experience of having helped their parents rear offspring pays off in terms of them being better parents with their initial brood. And of course, every brood thereafter, but every brood thereafter, they will already have had the experience of rearing their first brood. Now, this is a phenomenon called reciprocal altruism. You can think of it this way. I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. This is a controversial concept because it's highly susceptible to cheating. So, you're going to help another individual and you're going to rely on that person helping you when you need help. That person could be gone or the person could be there but just say, hasta la vista, baby, go help yourself, whatever. So it's susceptible to cheating. And another way of thinking about reciprocal altruism is actually a case of cooperation, which we looked at in another segment, but with a temporal component added in. So instead of cooperating at the same point in time, you're going to cooperate with some time interval in between. Not sure that it deserves this special status. In any event, call it whatever you want. Cooperation with a temporal component. I guess I kind of prefer that. Or reciprocal altruism. Despite all the controversy, I don't care. But I want to show you one example of this that was observed in the wild with olive baboons. Okay, so I just am drawing this out for you. So we have our dominant male. We'll call him Alpha, the alpha male, most dominant male. And then we have these two subordinate males, Fred and George. So, in case number one, Fred is going to solicit help from George to attack Alpha. So they're both attacking Alpha initially. Well, then what happens is that George continues to attack Alpha while Fred sneaks off and copulates with Alpha's mate. And then here's where the reciprocity comes in. What will then happen later on is that Fred will attack Alpha while George goes off and copulates with Alpha's mate. So this was actually observed in a wild troop. There was no experimental setup here whatsoever. So if you're going to behave altruistically toward your kin, who are your kin? You got to be able to recognize who your relatives are. Well, of course, if you've grown up with them, you know who they are. But there's various mechanisms of kin recognition. So let's look at these four mechanisms. And actually, it's only the first three that are realistic, but I'll mention the fourth just so you know it exists if you ever hear about it somewhere else. Spatial distribution is the first mechanism. Now, the interesting thing about this is you recognize locations, and you can only do that if your kin are distributed in these locations in a predictable fashion. Otherwise, you could be recognizing individuals who really aren't your kin if they sneak into the location where your kin just were. So it's location dependent. In other words, you are not directly recognizing the individuals as your relatives. You're only recognizing the place where your relatives are found and assume that whoever is there is your relative. So basically, you're only going to see this kind of thing working prior to fledging. And basically, we're going to be looking here at birds. Typical prior to fledging because of the nest site. So the animals might be, the parents might be recognizing the nest site, and it just so happens who's in the nest, your kin. But they're not directly recognizing their kin, unless you can demonstrate that they are. You typically see spatial distribution in operation as a kin recognition mechanism in colonial nesting birds, where there's a whole bunch of birds of the same species that are where the nests are densely packed together, like certain species of swallows. These are swallow nests, and you can see a whole bunch of nests packed together. So what happens here is we have the swallows returning to the nest having found food, and of course, who's in the nest? Well, their offspring. But they're not recognizing their offspring, they're just recognizing their own nest site. So there's a whole bunch of nests you can see, and then they're all going off, they're finding food, and going to go back to their nests, and they do recognize their own nests. They can sort that out. But it's an indirect form of kin recognition because it's really the nest that's being recognized. But of course, their kin is in the nest, so make of it what you will. Interesting thing about this is, if we look at 4 species of swallow that we have in North America, the bank swallow, the rough-winged, the cliff swallow, and the barn swallow. Well, evolutionarily, the bank swallow and rough-winged swallow are more closely related to one another than either is to the other two, and similarly, the cliff swallow and barn swallow are more closely related to one another than either is to the two up above. But it turns out that it's the bank swallow and cliff swallow that are colonial nesters, whereas the rough-winged and barn swallow are not. So in terms of kin recognition by spatial distribution, this has only been demonstrated experimentally to occur in the colonial nesting species. Again, demonstrated experimentally. And so it's not that the non-colonial ones don't recognize their kin. They do, but they're not doing it by spatial recognition. They're doing it by other means. Okay, next up, kin recognition by association. This is a very direct way of recognizing your kin. You learn who your kin are early in life, and then when you recognize that some time passes, you recognize them as your kin. You're not recognizing a nest site, you're recognizing who your kin are, and then when you encounter those specific individuals later on, could be any time later on, you somehow recognize them as your relatives. So for birds, it would be sometime after fledging. For non-birds, it would be sometime later on. So it turns out that cliff swallows, even though they do recognize nest sites, after fledging, they actually are learning the association of their offspring via their offspring's vocalization. So they learn to recognize the calls of their offspring, and then later on can recognize them by their calls. So early, before fledging, cliff swallows are recognizing the nest. But after those nestlings have fledged, but are still hanging around, the parents recognize the individuals by their vocalizations and then use that to continue to recognize them later on. Okay, here's an example in mammals. So we have mother-young recognition by pheromones. So moms learn the pheromones of their offspring. Offspring recognize the pheromones of mom. And they're learning specific individuals that way. Humans do the same thing. That's been demonstrated via pheromonal communication between mothers and infants and children, for example. Okay, the third type is interesting. It's called phenotype matching. Now, don't confuse this with association because it's very easy to do so. With phenotype matching, you're learning a relative's traits or even your own traits. And you're going to use that later on to match up against unfamiliar individuals. That's the difference between phenotype matching and association. With association, you are learning the specific individual, and you continue to recognize them forever, or as long as whatever. But with this, with phenotype matching, you're learning some characteristic of your relatives early on, or some characteristic of yourself, forming some kind of a mental template, for lack of a better term. And then when you encounter individuals that you never encountered before, there is something about them that matches this template in your head that shares features of your own relatives or yourself. And you are somehow matching that up. You're seeing some similarity. And you start to wonder, I wonder if that person could possibly be a distant relative of mine. That's phenotype matching, different from association, where it's the specific individual that you are learning as your relative. These are strange individuals that you encounter later on. It's been demonstrated in a lot of different species. I know it's been done in frogs and just a whole bunch of different species. And in pigtail macaques, for example. So let's look at some primates here. These are pigtail macaques. This was done experimentally using this apparatus. So you put your test subject in that middle compartment, and you put other monkeys in those surrounding compartments and measure the amount of time that the guy in the middle spends looking at the other ones through these one-way partitions. So he can see the other individuals, but the other individuals can't see the guy in the middle. Okay, and who are these other individuals in these compartments? Other individuals that vary in relatedness to the test subject, and maybe the one you'd have a control that's not related to the test subject at all. So it's kind of like that, okay? And then just see how much time that subject in the test compartment spends looking at these other individuals, or being next to the compartment of those other individuals. Interestingly, it was shown in this study that they can actually recognize paternal half-sibs. Same dad, different moms. I mean, that's a bit of a distant relative in terms of recognition. Maternal half-sibs would be closer, but not paternal half-sibs. They've never encountered these animals before, by the way. This is not recognition by association. They've learned some characteristic of either mom or themselves. And chances are it wouldn't be mom, come to think of it, because they're recognizing dads, and mom and dad are not genetically related to one another. It's probably some characteristic of themselves, but nobody knows what yet, and probably nobody ever will. But it could be their own coat color, something, who knows? But still a remarkable demonstration of kin recognition via phenotype matching. And it's even been demonstrated in chimpanzees using photographs of relatives. Here's what they did. These are the actual photographs in this experiment. So down that left column, we have mothers, and down the right column, we have offspring of the mothers, but they're all jumbled up. So who is related to who? So that mom is related to that daughter. In other words, that's the daughter of that mom. So here we have a mother, and here we have the son of that mother. Here we have a mother, and here we have the son of that mother. And here we have a mother, and there's the daughter of that mother. Okay. Now, the test subjects never saw these photos before, or the chimps in the photos, so they've never seen these particular individuals before, which is why we're dealing with phenotype matching here. And all they had to do was match the mothers and the offspring, and there was a lot more photographs than you see here, all kinds of control photographs. And so were they able to actually do this? Here's the results. They could match that and that. So they could match those two pairs, but not those two pairs. In other words, there was a visual basis for son and mother recognition, but not daughter and mother recognition via phenotype matching. And we don't know why, but those were the results of this study. Okay, this fourth mechanism is the one that's really only theoretical. It's based on a theory of sorts. I don't think it was a formalized theory, put forth by W.D. Hamilton. And it's basically based on alleles, which is a purely genetic model. Alleles are pairs of genes. And he called it recognition alleles, like the genes are recognizing something. Genes only code for proteins. That's why it's a theoretical model. So he said that the alleles that code for traits, even though they only code for proteins, so you follow my problem with this. But okay, we'll just follow his logic. The alleles that code for traits in one individual code for the ability to recognize those traits. Or as Richard Dawkins put it, he termed this the green beard effect in one of his publications. And of course, people don't have green beards, so he was purposely being absurd here. But basically, he was saying that whatever alleles code for green beards also code for the ability to recognize green beards. Again, a hypothetical model of kin recognition. So, we have the first three plus this one. But in any event, usually organisms are quite able to recognize who their relatives are. Now, we've been dealing with some invertebrates, we've been dealing with vertebrates, but I have yet to deal with this kind of a creature in this course, a protozoa. And kin recognition, not only that, but nepotism has been demonstrated in this species of social amoeba. And basically, what happens here is they prefer to form social groups only with kin in situations where some individuals actually end up dying in order to help others. That's why it's nepotism. They are really putting themselves at risk, the ultimate risk, death, by helping close relatives. No one knows how they do this, by the way. Now, these are found in social groups, not amoeba. Not all amoeba are, but this particular species is. So if the food supply is low, what will happen is thousands of the amoeba will come together to form what's called this fruiting body. That's just the technical term. And you can see how it forms over time. And you end up with a fully formed fruiting body. So the thing about this is, the ones that are on the stalk, the actual amoeba that form the stalk, will actually end up dying, so that the ones in the spore, the round structure, will be able to disperse and find food. Again, this happens when food supplies are low. They are putting themselves at the ultimate risk to help their relatives up on top in the spore. So there you have a bunch of examples of altruism and nepotism, and in terms of nepotism, how animals actually end up identifying who their close kin are so they can hopefully behave altruistically toward them.